Pieno. I think we have one point that maybe we have to think about it. The transition from the individual knowledge to the social knowledge. This is really a point that in some way is changing our vision. It is changing the relation between how to transfer knowledge from young to old people or vice versa. Then this is a good point maybe that we can discuss at the end of the session. The second intervention will be by Professor Giuliano Amato. Professor Giuliano Amato was, I cannot say too many things, was president of Prime Minister in Italy, is a judge of the Constitutional Court of the Italian Republic, and it's a lot of things more. His talk today is related to the impact of academies on European identity. Giuliano, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Francesco. Well, I thank Professor Mori for inviting me to this conference that gives me the opportunity just to tell you what I have in mind about this crucial moment in European life. And I was so impressed by the first speaker, Professor Loprieno, who has said, in my view, essential things to understand what we miss at the moment and what academies can do, not to fill completely the vacuum, but to contribute to do it greatly. My intervention has to do not necessarily with European knowledge societies, but if you want more basically, European societies as such, because our main concern now is to keep our national societies together and to nurture, as it was done in the past, the notion, the content, the feeling of a European society, which means European identity and national identities, which we have to accept it, have to coexist with each other, with the history that we have in Europe, with the rooted national histories, identities, cultures, traditions that are somehow the platform upon which wars were fought among us. Hatred, hostilities. Well, you can't expect, in the name of an essential task, such as building an integrated European construction, to completely supersede and delete national identities. Not even the founding fathers had this in mind. Not even Altiero Spinelli spoke of a European identity and society that should eliminate national identities and nation states. There were some essential functions to be conferred upon a supranational European organization. There were some basic principles, rules, and values that should be shared by all of us, but there was room, there had to remain room for our national diversities. And the European motto united in our diversities, has a substantial sense. We are and we will remain diverse. Our diversities should converge into a common construction instead of conflicting with each other. But here is the European kind of game we have been playing for years, having our diversities and dealing with them and with the European entity in such a way as to create the conditions of convergence and to eliminate the reasons for conflict. It was, for years, a successful endeavor. Really it was, because we created, don't forget it, a European community as an international organization on the basis of an international treaty, which means that the Herren, der Verträgen, were supposed to remain the nation states. And in theory, in an international organization, you should have had only the member states bound by the common decisions of the community and their citizens only involved by an internal act of the member states complying with the common decision. This is the way international organizations work. But the European community went beyond. We succeeded by treaty in creating an organization, the decisions of which could directly affect the life of the citizens. An international organization with a court, the European Court of Justice, having jurisdiction not only upon the disputes among the member states, but directly upon disputes raised by their own citizens for violations of the state's obligations according to the treaty. On the basis of a treaty, we created a parliament directly elected by the citizens that no international organization has in the world. And the Court of Justice, by using its powers, decided upon individual rights, finding them not only in the treaties, but also in the common constitutional traditions. And here you see how the national cultures, the national diversities can also be the source of something that is common. And therefore, this was part of the delicate balance between European and national in our construction. The European value, the European principle is not something coming from above, is something frequently discovered by working on the common constitutional traditions, and therefore drawing from our national cultures those common features that were the reasons for historians to speak of European culture, of a European civilization, of European styles of life, all of these things. This has worked, did work for several years. If we now speak of European crisis, and not only the Italians are doing it, because let me notice that the abuse of the word crisis in Italy is well known. Whatever happens to us is a crisis. And I still remember a taxi driver in New York, after my arrival, asking me, "You are Italian, how is your crisis now?" So crisis is a sort of permanent condition of the country, probably with a sort of excess, but not only the Italians, also the others seem to be aware of a difficulty in our common life for which the name of crisis seems appropriate. And actually it is a crisis in the allocation of powers. It is a crisis in the relationship between the Union and several member states. How many of them say, we won't allow Brussels to dictate to us the basic conditions of our life. Not only the Italians do it, also others. Difficulties or crises in the relationships between groups of member states or among member states. There is, as you well know, a north-south fracture in Europe. The Finns and the Germans running their risks, but not the risk to pay the debt of the Southerns. So the profligate Italians versus the northern wise people that defend themselves from us. And more recently, the fracture east-west, which has to do with something, if you want, even more essential, that is the rule of law, the core values of the European Union. So these things, as you well know, are not so happily dealt with in our time. So one might ask, shouldn't this one know the work of the academies? What have the academies to do with all of this? It is for politicians, it is for the parliaments. No. Everybody in Europe should be aware that the role of culture has always been the main ingredient in shaping national identities and also the European one. You well know that historians have different views on the relationship between culture and politics and political institutions in forging the nation. Is the nation something that stems from political will that is using cultural ingredients, or is the nation already existing because of a national culture that politicians may use when they want to work on national identities? I don't enter in that dispute. Years ago, I opposed those historians who said that the Italian nation was a creature of the Risorgimento in the name of Petrarca, Dante, and later on Leopardi. I argued that Italy pre-existed as a cultural entity that certainly was used during the Risorgimento, necessarily. But the nations are built upon culture, and if there is something that gave reason to Europe to be a reliable construction, this is the amount of European culture that throughout our national cultures was commonly built in this continent. And it was already noticed by our great colleague Federico Chabot years ago, and by others, that there were values, principles, patterns of life that were common to all the Europeans in such a way that no European feels a foreigner in a European country. It was written at the time. Now, what is happening now requires all of us to restore the essential role of these European ingredients of our culture. First of all, it is necessary for our citizens to feel that they have a European identity, that what they feel as important is due to their being European, not opposed to their being national, but also, if you want, to their being European. Nowadays, if you think of the difficulty, I prefer the word difficulty, that Europeans of different states have to live with each other, to accept each other, Don't forget that Brexit was due not to immigrants coming from other continents, but to European citizens of other member states that had entered the United Kingdom in a number that was considered excessive for them. But the difficulty is to accept each other, to accept diversities. Now, if there is a value that is European because we have learned throughout our experiences due to our internal wars, after years and years of wars of religion, of world wars, etc., is that mutual tolerance has to be the ground norm of a modern society. Somebody wrote, a great American scholar, Joseph Weiler, that the ground norm of the European Union was the principle of mutual tolerance. This is part of our being European, and without it, we lose the sense also of the rest. So, having said so, what do I expect from academies? First of all, allow me to underline this point, to be autonomous, you said it, and independent. I can understand the reasons in certain conditions for states to create state academies, possibly not. Because state academies become necessarily the vehicles of official cultures. Official cultures are dangerous, mostly in moments in which The sense of our European unity is at risk due to nationalistic, aggressive feelings that are spreading around. In this country, we celebrated last year, we remembered last year, it was the 80th anniversary of the racist laws of our fascist regime. Too many scholars gave their contribution to the insane racist theories of the regime that became legislation and seriously affected the lives of too many Italians. Not having an official academy at the time, I don't know whether it could have brought to different consequences, because this was an authoritarian regime. It was not easy. But several colleagues of ours remained out of it. The independence and the autonomy of academies is a prerequisite for them to freely express the culture that is needed, also if not fine-tuned with the governments of the moment. First point. Second point, restoring the nowadays weak reasons of our being Europeans means, first of all, what he said a few minutes ago, to give frames of reference likely to generate societal trust, where societal for me means European, at the European level, trust between Finns and Italians, trust between Poles and Germans, trust between anybody else and others. Of course, restoring frames of reference means also that each of us has to deserve the trust of others. But this is the one really point that has to be considered, and without it nothing can be done. If there is no mutual trust among us, any kind of societal construction is lost. So restoring trust, the trust that is needed among different people, despite their diversities. Now, academies do several things that demonstrate that this trust makes sense. Something that is European and that has not been touched by the events of these latest years is the organization of science. Scientific groups, only national, are very rare in Europe. Generally, when you work on something, on a project of research, you find yourselves with colleagues of other European countries. And this is a connecting tissue of Europe, extremely important. Academies have the role to nurture this kind of tissues, to demonstrate that what we do at the level of the knowledge society is almost never national, but it's always or almost always supranational. Something that is needed, and I would ask the academies to take care of it, is to strengthen the role recognized by some basic values, such as the rule of law. No society is conceivable without the respect of the rule of law. What has happened in Poland and in Hungary is something that has to be limited and changed to go back to the previous rules. And the pressure on them in order to restore the rule of law should come from everywhere. And the scientific world is the most qualified to play these roles, not politicians of other countries, because it could be considered as part of political fights. There is nothing political in expecting all of us to comply with the rule of law. And let me finally say something that perhaps is beyond credibility, but a society exists when it does have a common history. Our historians still write, with few exceptions, their histories at the national level, not necessarily because they only write the histories of their pieces of word, Italy, Belgium, France, etc., but because only from their angle comes the narration or whatever it is of the events of other parts of the world. Could we imagine a cluster of scholars, supranational the same way as supranational are the groups of research working in hard sciences, such kind of group giving us a history of Europe? It is an important sign. When you are in a position to write the same history as a German being Italian, what you have in common is prevailing on your diversities. Were I today in Sarajevo or Zagreb, I wouldn't advance the same proposal. I understand that it takes time for them to reach this level. But times are ripe for us to do it. And I would be happy to see an initiative of the academies aimed at the production at the European level of a common European history. It would be an excellent sign of health of the society we want to preserve. And let me finally say that having the European Federation of Academies is a great progress in this direction and gives me the sense that the long-standing battle of people like me and others to see physically the output of our battles, missions, etc., well, gives sense to what you have done. And I consider the alliance, because it exists, already an important result in the preservation of the European society. Thank you.
Thank you.